Thank you. I just wanted to briefly introduce the topic, and then we will go into some introductions. So we're going to be talking about economics in games, ranging from standalone PC to MMOs to even board and tabletops, and wherever economic concepts come into play. So this will kind of let you know what to watch out for, what to take advantage of, things like that. So we're going to be covering a lot of ground here, so we should have a lot of fun here. Just to introduce myself, I'm John M. Olsen. I'm an author, I'm an editor, I'm president of the League of Utah Writers, but more particularly for this panel, I'm also a 7-year game developer veteran. I worked at SingleTrack and Microsoft, but it was more than a decade ago, so yeah, I escaped the game industry quite a while ago. But right now I want to have each of our panelists introduce themselves, give a little bit about who they are and why they are here. So we're going to start with Brennan.
Hi, my name is Brennan Smith, but I go by Talonos online. A lot of my work is under that name. I am the director and the game design lead at a small indie studio called Space Heater Games. We just a week and a day ago released our first game. It's a time attack roguelike called Final Winter, and we're really excited about it. Someone contacted us to make a Switch port, so we're enthused. Before that, I worked making Minecraft mod packs on commission for Technic, and that's how I paid my way through grad school. The biggest mod pack that I made was a quest-driven mod pack called Blightfall, and it got over 2 million downloads. And that's my background.
Well, congrats on the release. Let's move over to Bruce now for introductions.
Hi, I'm Bruce Webster. I'm a real old timer here. I was doing game design work 40 years ago, writing columns for both the Space Gamer and Computer Gaming World on computer game design. And then in 1982, joined Oasis Systems to form FTL Games, where Wayne Holder and I did Sundog Frozen Legacy for the Apple II, subsequently ported to the Atari ST. I have not done active game design since then, though I'm currently serving as an expert witness in a patent lawsuit that has to do with game design and game aspects.
Hey, my name is Skye Larsen. I definitely have an interest in both the digital as well as the tabletop side of gaming. I started out for a while, I was working on a video game, and right now kind of my path has led me more towards board games, but yeah, love games. I'm helped produce the Game Design Roundtable podcast, which has been around for several years, does both video and board games. I work currently as a freelance designer and developer and rulebook editor for board games. And a lot of that work is with Fowers Games, who are local here in Utah. They make games like Burgle Bros, Paperback. So one of the biggest games I've worked on is Burgle Bros 2 that should be coming out anytime now, as soon as the boat gets here in America, but it's coming out real soon.
Okay, so there we have our esteemed panelists. Oscar Wilde is credited with a quote that goes, "The cynic knows the price of everything and the value of nothing." Now, game economics seems to force us past this to where we actually have to know both. But I wanted to just jump in and get some opinions from you up front. So what do we mean by an economic system? I'm sure it's going to vary a little bit based on what kind of system you're talking about. But if you've got something that you want to just jump in with here, Brennan, you had something.
Yeah, when I look up economics, it says that economics is the wealth and resources of a country or a region, especially in the production and the consumption of the goods and services. And I think that one thing to highlight is that it's not talking about the wealth and resources of an individual, but rather of a country or a region. Because of that, when I think of economic systems, I mostly think of multiplayer games, especially massively multiplayer games, but there are some single-player games that do this too. But what I don't think of when I think of economics is a typical RPG system where you can go to a store and buy a potion for a certain amount and sell a sword for a certain amount. That, in some ways, is more like a glorified crafting system. You go out and you create a raw material called, like in Final Fantasy, Gil, and then you go to a crafting table called the Chocobo Sage, and you craft it into Chocobo Greens. And that's different from, for example, Sundog's Legacy, was that the name of it?
Sundog, Frozen Legacy, yeah.
Frozen Legacy. From what I saw in that, they instead had a supply and a demand system where if you were to oversell something in a certain region, the prices would rise because you were simulating an economy. But if there is no simulation of supply and demand, or in other words, the way in which goods and services are produced and consumed, I don't consider it to be a game economy. I consider it to be a crafting system where you craft things via currency.
Yeah, and to Brennan's comments, with Sundog, part of the basic premise was that you inherited this starship tradership. You had this contract commitment to deliver a increasing series of goods to this colony under development, but you didn't have the money for it. So you had to go out and make the money and then buy goods and deliver them, then go make some more money. And as for Brennan's comment, and I've got a slide I'll put up later, a lot of our work was on simulating an interstellar economy where we actually had a basic set of goods, but not everyone provided them. You had supply and demand that was modeled on a planet by planet basis. It would recover over time, but you couldn't set up cheap and easy runs. They would basically contraindicate. And as you went along, you learned aspects such as, some were wealthier economies, some were high tech, some were low tech, some were law. All of this would influence the price of goods. To this day, in fact, to your point, Brennan, there was I'm trying to think of the game, fairly new one I just picked up on Steam, and I started looking and noticing I was paying exactly the same price for something wherever I went. And I thought, oh, that's a cheat. I don't even have to figure out how much it costs in a certain place. It's exactly the same price for the same good, no matter where I am at different locations within this large universe.
And that's not an economy, that's a crafting system. It's as you say, it's sort of a cop-out.
Yeah.
Hey, Skye, you want to chime in?
Go ahead and rebut at that position. And it just comes down to definitions and like where you want to put the scope of economy. Because another definition of economy is management of resources. And resource management is really common in all games. So there's economies at scale. There's economies that are multiplayer or do involve supply and demand, the economy of a world. But then it's not an unfamiliar concept. Like we talk about being like time economy. Like are they economic with their time? And
or card economy and Magic the Gathering.
Yeah. So these are it's a different conversation. And so and I think that can still be useful for developers because honestly resources kind of make a game in some ways. They kind of set it apart from a toy or other things you play with because there's a limit on what you can do and you have to decide what you're going to do with it. And so, they just have different types of conversations around them. So if we spend most of our time talking about those larger economies at scale, I'm totally down with that. But there is, I think, also places to talk about economy when it comes to what adds resources to a game system, what takes away resources from a game system, and how you convert those resources.
Yeah, I think for the purposes of our discussion here, we're going to kind of grandfather in some of those wider scope questions as well, because there's some interesting stuff to talk about there as well. Kind of just to get things kicked off here, in that realm, do all games really have that broader scale definition of an economy? And if not, what kind of game level do you get to where it starts needing something like that? I mean, if you're playing Go Fish, you could technically say that has some of these same aspects to it where you're trying to do card management.
Yeah. Really?
Go ahead, Brennan.
I feel as though in a single player game, it really depends on what target fantasy that you're going for. In Frozen Legacy, because the target fantasy was I'm an interspace trader, you needed an economy in order to make that target fantasy work. But in other games, like Skyrim, you don't necessarily need that unless you want to make trading a big sub-game, a sub-fantasy that you could hit. And in other games like Dragon Quest, an economy might be completely inappropriate because that's not what your target fantasy is. With multiplayer games, it's different, though, because if you allow players to trade amongst themselves at all, you've got an economy whether you wanted one or not. And if we end up getting into the whole Diablo 3 debacle, I've got some comments about that, because that was an interesting case study of the way that economies could help or hinder the fantasy of a multiplayer game.
Yeah, I've seen cases where various games have a conversion rate between real dollars and game dollars. So
EVE Online, any game with gold sellers, yeah.
And to Brennan's point, one of the games I've picked up recently is Star Frontiers Traders, which I really like. And ostensibly, it's a trading game. So that was like, oh, this is going to be cool. It's going to remind me of Sundog. And what I quickly learned in the game itself is that most trading is worthless. the actual amount of cargo you can carry and the prices for the goods generally don't provide any incentive to worry about trading, except as something very incidental. And all the real gains come from these side missions and going around and, killing pirates and capturing people and transporting diplomats and everything else. And I complained a little about that to the developers. I said, can't you make the cargo bay 10 times as large? It'd actually be worth it. And they said, well, if you do this, and this, you can actually make a lot of money on a trade. And I've got quite a few hours into it. And like I said, I rarely even worry about trading because it is so inconsequential to the game design, in spite of the name and in spite of the mechanism being in place. So part of the point is, if you're going to put a mechanism in place, make sure it's something that the player is actually interested in and can do something meaningful with, rather than being, nibbled to death by ducks economically.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I'll say when you do expand that definition out, just as resource management, I think where probably all games at that point do have some type of economy, but there's just kind of a scale of strict versus like a loose economy. And the more loose it is, the more the game will be kind of sandboxy. And I don't know Star Trader super well, but maybe that's kind of what's going on there, where, they're trying to give more of a sandbox where it's like, hey, you can do lots of things in the game.
Oh, yeah.
And they don't really want to tighten down, make those tough decisions of like, where a stricter economy, whether that's money, whether that's like turns, like you only have so many turns you can do, and you have to be really economic with your usage of your turns, like that creates just a different game experience. So, so I think a lot of games do have an economy in that sense, but there's definitely degrees to which, the economy plays a role or kind of just takes a back seat to really let the players do whatever they want to have, their type of fun.
Yeah, that kind of ties into the issue of balancing an economy as well. I think, Brennan, you had mentioned something up front about broken gaming system. What kinds of things can break an economy, and how do you keep something like that balanced?
Okay, so one of the things that is an interesting difference between real life economies and game economies is that in game economies, in almost every one, players have the ability to print their own money by grinding in some way. And sometimes grinding takes the form of actually getting currency, and other times it takes the form of getting extremely high value goods, such as a best in slot drop, which is to say the best item in the game for a given character class or equipment slot or something like that. And when players can print their own money, basically, in order to keep the economy from hyperinflating, you also need a way to remove money from the economy, and that's gold sinks, or gill sinks was the original term because it was coined in Final Fantasy XI. And in order to have these sinks, basically the designers need to insert points into the game where players must do things that remove money from the economy. And there needs to be a balance between the money that is being printed through currency and the money that is going out. And that's where something that can really break games is gold farming. When gold farmers come in, they basically bring their own money printing machines. And you could say, well, okay, that's fine. We'll just increase the price of the gold sinks. But that means that you've got a whole lot of currency coming in from the robots and a whole bunch of currency coming out from the normal people who are using the gold sinks, because the robots don't use them. They just print their own money instead of needing to travel from place to place or use marketplace fees or something like that. And so if you're not careful, you could end up bleeding all of the currency away from the people who are playing the game normally, and it only comes in from the people who are paying real life money from the gold farmers, and that could cause an economy to collapse. My wife said that one of the differences between a real life economy and a game economy is that in a game economy you don't die if you run out of money and can't feed yourself. But that's not the case. What happens is that you need a certain amount of money as a player in order to have fun playing the game. And if you don't have enough money to have fun playing the game, you leave and find something more fun to do, and your character dies due to lack of a player. So in other words, yeah, your player base will starve to death if they don't get enough money to continue having fun. And so, yeah, you really do need to worry about the population of your game servers and its economy, because otherwise it will literally die off from starvation.
I'll note with amusement in Sundog, it was possible to run out of money and starve to death. You had to eat. You literally had to eat and sleep, which in retrospect, I'm not sure was a great game design thing, but you did have to eat and sleep. You did have to buy food. And if you ran out of food and went long enough, you would literally keel over and die.
And Brennan, just to be clear, like with our listeners and stuff, so one of these gold sinks, for example, would be like mount training, in order so you can buy a horse, right? Okay.
Paying NPCs for weapon upgrades is a huge gold sink in Dungeon Fighter Online.
Anything that's a consumable, potions, stuff like that. Something that you have that you can only use once, yeah, they're great sinks.
So long as they come from an NPC store, because if they're crafted by players, then it doesn't actually remove the money from the economy. The key thing about a gold sink is that it has to go to the NPCs or developers, not to another player.
Right. So why do you really care if the economics of a game is broken? Yeah, I remember one particular game, you might be able to figure out which one I'm talking about, where you could make a potion that made you better at making potions. And so you could just make this daisy chain until you could create these phenomenal things. Luckily, it wasn't a network multiplayer game, but yeah, when do you care if the economics of a game system break?
When players don't have enough money to have enough fun, and they quote unquote starve to death.
And so it sounds like it's much more of an issue in a multiplayer realm. If it's a single player game and it breaks, well, yeah, you can just decide, well, how do I deal with this? Do I use those things that are breakable?
If it's a single player game, yeah, basically broken mechanics are a dial your own difficulty slider, and it's less of an issue.
On the flip side, one of the things that delighted me about Sundog, normally you were buying cargo, you store it in your ship, you fly to another planet, another system or whatever. And pirates can detect if you have cargo in your ship. And they'll only attack you if you've got cargo. And then you can either try to fight them or you can dump the cargo, usual stuff. But in Sundog, you could also go into stores, you could go into bars and meet people at a booth and buy illegal upgrades for your ship, and you could buy drugs that would boost your that boost your dexterity or your charm or your intelligence and help you out with that. And something I discovered after the game shipped is that there were players who wouldn't buy cargo at all. they would make runs because you had a storage locker on board the ship. And they would go through the process of buying up lots and lots of components, like special ship components on a high-tech world, and they'd fly to a low-tech world where they weren't available in the store, and they could make a killing selling them at the bar. It tickled me, that they found a way around getting attacked by pirates, but, and again, to your point, the value there was that it really wasn't a cheat because it was a far more tedious and time-consuming process. So they had the option of either buying cargo and, transporting it and taking their chances with the pirates, or there was a lower risk but more tedious in terms of time that was required way of making money, and it was a way for them to make a trade-off as to where how they wanted to buy the risk. And that, I think, this gets to an important point: what is the risk in the economy for the certain ways you have of making money?
Like bug, feature. Sometimes you can't tell.
I just want to make a warning. If the most effective way to get currency is also the most tedious way, then you're incentivizing your players to do something tedious, which makes the game not fun because they spend the majority of their time doing something tedious.
Yeah.
So you got to be careful what you incentivize using your virtual currency or wealth.
Yeah, and I think, like tedium is a good example. Like also like a way a system can be broken is if it creates just bad feeling moments for the players, which feels kind of loosey-goosey. But I mean, a good example is you'll see a lot of games like will throw in these giant sinks towards the end of the game for money. Something like Stardew Valley, where it's a great game. They keep updating it. There's always new stuff, which is kudos to the developer, Concerned Ape. But you get to this point where you just have so much money, and that's like the key system of the game is selling crops to make money, and like, what do I spend my money on, so he keeps coming out with updates for you to like, well, now you can buy this crazy thing that lets you teleport across the map, because you need something to like work towards, or it can start to feel a little directionless. I'm similar with a meta economy system in League of Legends, where you had I can't even remember what it used to be called. Now it's called Blue Essence.
Influence points, IP.
IP, yeah, that's right. And so you would have there was a problem with the really dedicated players would just have so much IP that they earned kind of passively that they couldn't really spend it anymore, and that just feels bad. You could argue, well, that's, you get to play the game and that's fun, but you still want to try and avoid those moments where the players feel like, well, I don't have anything to do with this, so it feels useless. So they're trying to come up with creative ways to get players to spend 100,000 IP just for something maybe even stupid, but at least it was something that they could, claim that they're working towards.
And to your point, I'm trying to think of the game, something I've been playing within the last month or two. I pretty much tapped out the tech tree as far as stuff I could buy. And it's kind of like, what do I do now? I want something even better and more powerful than what I've got. And I'm bumping up against the top of the tech tree. It's kind of like, oh no, give me something more powerful. Give me something more I can work towards, and literally, and then within the context of the game, spend money on.
Exactly. Something that kind of ties into that I'd like your opinions on. What about multiplayer games where you have the whole patron effect, where the high-level player dumps a fortune on a low-level player so that they can get up to speed faster? What can that do to your economy?
I mean, most games prevent it. The MMO my wife plays, you have a maximum bank size that is capped by your level, and most of the top tier equipment is untradeable. So I don't think that I've ever seen that happen since RuneScape, back when I played in middle school and someone gifted me with a full set of iron armor at level 1.
Yeah, so that sounds like something that's been addressed by a lot of companies already then.
Yeah, or you design around it. If I speak too much, I'm gonna say something wrong because it's been a while since I played World of Warcraft. But I know that they worked on systems where, heirloom items or something like that. They kind of started to design around the idea of players are gonna create a new character, and they're gonna want to like give all their cool stuff to that new character, and so they started to kind of just take that as an assumption, and then design around that assumption.
Yeah, a lot of stuff is account bound too, because after you go through the leveling up experience once, you kind of want to shortcut it the next few times you go through if you're just leveling up alternate characters.
So that's not a true patron, I guess, but giving it to your next character instead.
Yeah, it seems like it's really useful to have high-level friends, but the game designers, I think, are taking a lot of steps to keep that from being a super easy path. What about having economies that are fixed versus variable? Brennan, this is something that you had talked about right at the start, where it really doesn't seem like a viable economy. It's more just a skill-based crafting thing if it isn't a variable system. But why would you want to use one versus the other?
In a multiplayer game, you would have a variable economy if you want to facilitate player interaction. If you make it so that players can trade certain things with each other, then you end up having a lot more player interaction. People form communities, people form guilds, things like that. But if you do that, you need to watch out. I'm thinking specifically of Diablo 3. In Diablo 3, it was kind of a single-player game, but they also had the auction house system. And because of the auction house system, it sort of ruined the ability for the developers to include rare drops, because whenever the best in slot dropped, that was immediately a super high value item that could go on the auction house, and then somebody else would buy it. So if you got that, then you were basically set, and you can trade it for another best in slot. But because of that, you had to make best in slot super rare. And that made it so that a lot of players, especially players playing casually, didn't see them. Whereas on the other hand, all the players who played consistently and they were farming for those best in slots, they would get so many second best in slots that they had way more than they knew what to do with. And the price of that in the auction house completely tanked. And you can get them for a super low price because nobody wanted them, because they were the second best and not the absolute best. And so you could very easily pick up the second best, and you almost never got a best in slot drop. Finally, somebody came in order to fix it. I think it was Johnny Ebert was the designer that did this, and he just said, no, the way to fix Diablo 3 is to remove most of the auction house so that people can't trade equipment anymore. And when that happened, they were able to make the rare drops over 10 times more common, because if you got a rare drop, you could only trade it within your account. And you didn't have this problem of like accidentally inflating the economy by setting too much out. So they changed Diablo 3 from a variable economy to a fixed economy, and it made the loot system work when previously it was kind of broken and unfun.
If we come back and talk a little bit more about maybe like auction barter systems, or something like that, I might chime in. But
okay, I think we'll get to that in just a little bit. Bruce, did you have anything you wanted to cover on the economy fixed versus variable first?
Not different from what I talked about before with whatever game it was I was playing, that where it's kind of like, why are the prices the same everywhere I go? It's like I sort of expect some degree of variation, having to know that. So I will leave it at that.
Okay, so what about barter systems? It seems like there's an awful lot that can even get into metagaming there, like Magic the Gathering, card trading, things like that. How does bartering play into this? Skye, you want to lead us off on that?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, this is where, like in tabletop, there are a lot of games that like to have these auction systems or trade systems. I think the first game for, a lot of people who started to get into hobby board gaming was Settlers of Catan. And that has kind of a loose, trading system. And those types of games are fun, but they become a large part of the game itself. And for some people, that might not be the style of play they enjoy. So for example, I don't really like games like that, and that might be kind of a personal, I don't like conflict I don't like direct conflict, and I like players to be happy. So that makes like an auction system. You have these conflicting motivations where it's like, yeah, I'm playing the game to win. I want to win, but I also like don't want this person to be mad at me. And you can get kind of weird situations, where there's kind of this metagame aspect, like outside of the game, like, well, are they going to not talk to me after the game because I did this or whatever? And to be fair, games can do that, without an auction system too. But I tend to prefer games that don't do that. But it's just about player preferences. And so just know what type of game you want to make. Know the weaknesses, the strengths of that. For example, like pure auction games can be really fun, but they can also be terrible first-time experiences. Where if you like start your game off with an auction, and it's like, well, how much money should I guess? While the experienced player knows, like, I know that this is about how much I should be spending, because they've had enough experience with the game to kind of get a feel for what the base value more or less is. So if you can, with some things like like those types of blind auctions that can just be brutal, like just ruin a player's first game. And if they have the grit to keep playing and learn, like it could become an awesome game for them. But the fact is there's a lot of games out there, and maybe they'll just say like, that game sucks, I don't want to play it again, and only the players who get super invested will play it. So just be mindful of like which type of economic system might make sense for your game and what types of players that's going to attract, because players have different things they like.
Yeah, that kind of takes us back to something that I'd mentioned in some notes that we were trading beforehand, and that's the theme to an economy or a game and how those kind of interact, where it has to be some kind of a match between how the economy works and how the game is played. I think, Bruce, you had mentioned something about how a particular game really hadn't hit that very well because the trading, even though it looked like it was going to be a significant piece of the game, wasn't actually. So what do you do to make sure that you're actually following those themes in your design and making them useful?
Well, with Sundog, this is running in 64K on an Apple II, and our economic system was implemented probably in maybe roughly a dozen pages of Pascal code. And the interesting thing was that people thought it was far more complex than it was. Because of some of the obscurity there, I literally talked to players who would play Sundog on an Apple II and then have a Mac next to it with a spreadsheet or database to track the values. And it was very simple calculations. Basically, you had these different cargo types with quality values for a given lot of cargo. You had wealth law and tech values for each system that would influence the price. We modeled supply and demand with a 2-week game time recovery effort so that if you tried to keep buying, it'd simply run out. Price would go up and then you'd run out. And some places didn't want your stuff, so it didn't matter if you tried to, if you kept selling it, they'd pretty say, no, we don't want it at all. You had different prices based on different cities on the planet. Each load of cargo knew where it had been bought, so you couldn't buy it, then turn around and sell it at the same port and try to make a profit, by cornering the market or whatever. So there was this in the end, this calculation of about half a dozen, well, actually about 8 or 9 different factors that would go into the price in the exchange. And it created to the player an aura of this is a dynamic economy, and I'm just going to have to buy some goods and I'm going to fly to this other planet and hope I make a profit there. And you learn over time, they do want JJunk modules. They do not want antigravs. And I still get fan mail on Sundog. Frankly, I thought the game was a bit of a grind, to be honest. And of course, part of it's because I developed, but part of it is, when I was done, it's kind of, this needs to be more interesting. It needs to be better. But a lot of people were enamored with it. The subsequent Atari version, which I wasn't involved in, but was largely a port, added a few more story elements, which is important. But the whole point is with a relatively simple behind the scenes efforts, you can give a degree of apparent complexity to the economy that makes a game fun hopefully without it becoming tedious.
Yeah, that kind of ties into one of the maxims of game design that I learned early on. If it looks good, it is good. And so it is a matter of cheating in a way that makes the game fun. That's the real goal there. Nobody cares if you've modeled things according to the way some particular scientist says something should be modeled. If it's fun, then that's great. And that's one of the huge goals in all of this with having an economy in a game. You want it to be something that excites the players, something that they would be willing to write fan mail to the people developing it saying, this was really cool. And so that's kind of one of the goals that we always ought to have in mind there. But you brought up the idea of complexity. We can talk about that for just a couple of minutes, and then I wanted to open up for about 5 minutes of questions. Okay, the idea of complexity, how do you manage that? Because like you said, you want it to look complex without it being really hard to maintain. How do you handle that balance?
I've got a funny anecdote. There's this one AI programmer that was working on a turn-based tactics game, and he developed this really complicated algorithm to make it so that enemies would outflank the player. Like if they were receiving fire from one position, they'd split up, go to other sides, and then shoot inward at the players. But there was fog of war in this game, so the players couldn't see the AI as it went through its its multi-turn path in order to pop up out from somewhere else and shoot them. And the AI programmer got fan mail that said, wow, I really love how when your AI agents disappear into the fog of war, you teleport them into positions that make sense as for how they would outflank me. Like, you did a really good job faking that. And the AI programmer just threw up his hands and it's like, I wasn't faking it. Like, they're actually moving. You just can't see it because there's fog of war. I think a lot of times economic systems are like that. As you were talking about with Frozen Legacy, if you are able to fake it so that it looks like there's something really interesting going on when your math is comparatively simple, that's what you want to hit on. If you have an appearance of complexity, but with simple, easier to program mechanics, then you can have the benefit of the immersiveness without the cost of having to actually program the AI agents to trade amongst themselves.
And to that point, people will tend to read more intelligence and complexity into software than is actually there. They'll tend to think, oh man, it figured out how it was doing that. And it's like, well, actually it was just a random roll. But anyway, so I love the story because I know exactly what you're talking about with the people saying, oh yeah, it did this and this. Like, well, no, actually it was just this little path algorithm I was doing.
Okay, let's open things up for about 5 minutes of questions. Then that'll give us about 5 more minutes after that to do some summaries. So if you have any questions, our assistant here can get those to us.
All right. First question is, with some games, in particular free-to-play MMOs, you will occasionally see a form of premium currency, one that you pay real money for. Do you find that sort of breaks in-game economies, or does it enhance them in ways?
So the example that I think of is the MMO that my wife plays called Dungeon Fighter Online. There, people can buy with premium currency packages that they can then sell to other players for in-game currency. And that is good for an economy because it allows people to buy gold without actually buying gold. Because when the people buy this stuff for the premium currency and then trade it for normal currency, it's not adding any currency to the economy. It's just moving currency from place to place while adding value to the economy in the form of the good, the premium good that you just sold. So in that way, it sort of like undercuts gold sellers at the knees by making it so that they have to compete with the developers because the developers can sell something for a certain amount of premium currency, and then that gets converted into the virtual currency, and makes it so the gold farmers don't really have a place anymore.
Anyone else on the value of the premium currency?
Yeah, I tend to, having had a few experience with some mobile games, if a mobile game starts offering me packs for money, it's kind of like this is a pay to win game. And that's where it goes bad. I like the thing that Talonos is describing, but if it's a pay to win, it's kind of like I can either grind for a long time to get this, or I can, pay $1.99 and get this pack and short circuit this. And it's what they do to mine real money for themselves, quite frankly.
Well, but if the pack is tradable using in-game currency, then you can grind in order to get that pack, because all you need to do is buy it from somebody who's willing to spend real-world money on it.
But these are mostly single-player games where you're simply buying a pack to boost, the armor and weapons and abilities you have.
If it's pay to win like that, then basically you're paying the company not to play their game. It makes no sense.
Yeah.
Well, there is one case where it might make sense, and that's to give the casual player a more equal footing with the rabid player. And so if that's the way they design it to work, then that actually can have some benefit.
But then the rabid player feels bad because they put all of this work into it and they get beaten by a casual player, and it's your rabid players that form the community base that propels your game through word of mouth. If you take off your rabid players, then you're shooting yourself in the feet.
Mishley asks, what are your thoughts on the game developers having direct control over the economy? Is it good or bad, and how much is too much?
That's an interesting one, because there are a lot of places where the developers are completely isolated from that.
That's interesting. I assume this is, you're talking about an MMO or someplace where the developers can go in and say, yeah, let's tweak this, let's tweak that. I personally would probably find that appalling as a player. It's like, no, don't change things under me. I want to make sure it's consistent and a level playing ground.
The thing is that the developers, anytime they release a patch, they're changing things, even in microtransactions. There was a currency in Dungeon Fighter Online called Emperor Helm Seals, which were needed in order to level your character up past a certain level and to unlock their abilities. And then one day they changed it so that the seals of Emperor Helm were no longer required to level up. And when that happened, the price of Emperor Helm seals went from 10,000 gold each to 500 each. And anybody who was in the process of exchanging that currency in order to try and get gold out of it by buying low and selling high, they just lost their entire inventory, lost millions and millions of gold. Anytime you make a balance change, anytime you release a new weapon that's better than the old weapon, anytime you do anything, it's going to affect the economy.
Kind of like a GameStop trader.
Yeah.
Well, I think we have just enough time to go through some closing comments from each of you, some summary where people can find the kinds of things that you are involved in, web links, whatever, and we will wrap things up. So let's start with you, Skye.
It's a great discussion. I want to thank all the other panelists, and then definitely lean on you for some more of these complex economies with MMOs and stuff like that. But like I said, I'm working with Powers Games. Burgle Bros 2 is a cooperative heist game. So you just go steal the money instead of worrying about an economic system. That's coming out just any day now. You can pre-order it right now from fowers.games. And then we're going to be working on another game where I'll actually be the lead designer on that, coming out soon on Kickstarter. It's a sequel to his game Paperback, which is a deck-building word game. So if that sounds something interesting to you, go ahead and keep following Powers Games for more info.
Okay, thank you. Bruce, you want to give us your summary?
Yeah, and it's basically summed up by the point that you don't need to make things overly complex. Again, as Brennan has pointed out, and as I commented, people will read complexity and intelligence into even relatively simple systems. Though, again, as per comments here, you want to make sure that there's no way it can be unfairly gamed. In other words, you want to do enough play testing to make sure your economics don't break down because someone has discovered something magic they can do.
Speaking of playtesting, there's a panel on playtesting coming up soon.
There you go.
All right. Yeah, that's another thing I didn't mention. If you're going to be on another panel, go ahead and give that a mention as well.
I've got one presentation tomorrow, The Field of Life and Death, which is a completely different topic, not about gaming, but about writing about nuclear weapons and international strategy on that.
Okay, Brennan, you want to give us your summary?
Definitely. If you're playing a single player, if you're making a single player game, I wouldn't worry overly much about the economy. But if you're making a multiplayer game like an MMO or anything that involves trading, I'd say you really need to go out and educate yourself. There are books on the topic. There are classes on the topic. Know what you're getting into. Understand supply and demand, that sort of thing. My game, Final Winter, the one by Space Eater Games, is available on Steam. If you Google Final Winter Steam, you'll be able to find it. It's a speedrunning RPG. It doesn't have an economy in it. That's by design, but we're enjoying it. So thank you.
I think the two biggest points that I've picked up out of this is that any design that you put together for a game in general or an economic system in particular is it really must feel fair and it really must be fun. If you can't hit those two, then you need to go back to that design board and come up with something that's better. Lots of other cool things that we've talked about here, the ideas of complexity, how to make good use of it to have the appearance of complexity with some simple mechanics. There are lots of fun things that you can play around with, whether you're doing tabletop design, whether you're doing online design, whether you're doing single player, whatever it is. So there's a lot of great resources that we've heard from our panelists here. And so I wanted to thank each of you for all of your input. And I hope it's been a wonderful educational time with everybody out there listening in. So I think we are about done now, but thank you all so much for joining us at LTUE.